Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about a period of the Civil War, but I wanted to talk about a specific part of it. I've been on this kick. I've been talking about parts of the Civil War and things that were done and things that happened. I have a lot of other stuff I want to talk about. But today I would like to talk about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, who was our 16th president, elected because the Democratic Party split. It's the only reason he got elected, because more votes went to the Democrats. But the fact is that since they split, they had several different candidates. And whenever that happens in any election, the individual on the opposing side is guaranteed to win. Lincoln knew it. Everybody knew it. That's why the South was ready to secede, and they did. But Lincoln is a fascinating, interesting, bizarre, and mysterious individual. There's so much about Lincoln we don't understand. There's so much about Lincoln we don't know. Because Lincoln was an extremely private individual. Lincoln went out of his way to hide much of his life. Lincoln went out of his way to say only what he had to. And even with the personality of Lincoln, who was extremely melancholy, as they put it in those days, he was constantly depressed, not just during the time of the Civil War, but go all the way back to the 1830s. He was suffering from melancholy, as they put it, which is depression. He seems to have been extremely depressed at times, suffer from depression. He did drink for a little while, but he gave that up because it made him peevish, he said, which, if you don't know the word peevish, which is kind of an old word, kind of made him get violent, because he had one hell of a temper. That's the thing about Lincoln we don't know. He learned how to control that temper, because he would pick people up by their throats and argue with them. I mean, when he was angry, he could tear apart a place, because he was a big, strong guy. Interesting thing also about Lincoln is when you read histories, and especially over the years, we have created the image of Lincoln. And I find it rather fascinating, because the image of Lincoln is not necessarily who Lincoln was, but it's become more our understood image of Lincoln. I'm trying to find a way to describe this. In history, everything that is history, if I just take like a cloth here as an instance, what we do with history is we take a nice big glass of something and pour it through the cloth. And what the cloth captures is bits and pieces that really don't need to be in the history. In my understandings, I'm more interested in the bits and pieces than what goes through the cloth, because what goes through the cloth is strange history. And we have a habit of demonstrating and being remarkable in the fact that we show so much strained history. Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, and he had a law practice. He had a couple of them, but his last partner and longest lasting partner was William Herndon. And William Herndon, and he had a law practice in Springfield, and Herndon did something very interesting. After Lincoln's death, and even before Lincoln's death, he started interviewing everybody he knew about Lincoln. He started writing down everything he knew about Lincoln, because nobody knew Lincoln better than Herndon. In many cases, I'm wondering how much Mary Lincoln truly understood about her husband. She saw him on all different sides. We always talk about how crazy Mary was, but Lincoln wasn't far behind. This was an interesting match of people who both had a lot of issues. But Herndon, in the 1880s, wrote the series of books with Jesse Wilk, I think his name was. Let me see if I can find the name, the fellow that helped him. Jesse Weik, Welk, Wyke, or whatever, however it's pronounced, I'm not sure. But let's just call him Jesse Week. And it was poo-pooed by historians everywhere. And why was this? Because by the 1880s into the 1890s, Lincoln was already starting to become a deity. He was already becoming a god. He had stopped being human. The moment he died, he stopped being human. He had joined that pantheon of individuals that had been statues when alive, like George Washington. And by the time we get into the 20th century, it gets worse. And there's a lot of misquotations by Lincoln. There's a lot of statements by Lincoln that aren't by Lincoln. And these books were poo-pooed once again through the 20th century, saying they were trash, they weren't substantiated, blah, blah, blah. And only recently have historians finally come to their senses and realized what an absolute treasure trove we have here from Herndon. Because here is Lincoln, the man, the animal, the person, the way he spoke. You have to understand that Lincoln has also been Disneyed. If you went to the World's Fair in 1964-65 or go to Disneyland or Disney World, Lincoln talked like this. And that is the furthest thing from how Lincoln talked. Lincoln was from Kentucky. Lincoln had a high-pitched voice, and when he got excited, he would shriek. Now, they could not present him that way in that most recent movie about Lincoln. They made him high-pitched, but they didn't have him shrieking and getting up on his he would stand up and kind of stretch out and let out a lot of interesting sounds. He was also from Kentucky and moved to Indiana and Illinois. But the accent that he had, the way he spoke, I mean, people used to write down the way he said things, like a chair. How did he pronounce chair? Cheer. A crick. Radiator. These are words that they wrote down. It was kind of fascinating. And when he said earth, it was earth. And so when you start thinking about how he said these words, and you start thinking about how he spoke, Mr. Cheerman, it was a very different sound. Now, he was a man of his time. There was a lot of people that talked like that. Today, we would not understand it at all. I would imagine that today, if we heard Lincoln live doing the Gettysburg Address, we would be shocked. But people back then weren't, because a lot of people talked that way. But to have Lincoln speaking as this polished, amazing speaker, I don't think it's a very fair estimation of him. Lincoln was a very private man. He never kept a diary. He did nothing to perpetuate his memory, especially his youth. I think he was very embarrassed about his youth. The other thing is that he had a very hard time with his father. His mother died when young. His stepmother was very helpful, read a lot, self-taught in many respects, went to blab school. But he was not a warm, friendly person. He gave the impression of being. He had a veneer that was jokes and laughter and smiles, but deep inside, there was a very, very cold politician. A very cold politician. And one person who knew him said he used men around him like chess pieces. He used them until they weren't needed anymore, and then he tossed them away. And that's the way Lincoln kind of was. And that's the kind of Lincoln that you read about here. You find somebody very, very different. And Lincoln was a very private man. And Lincoln didn't want you to know much about him. And he was successful, because today we only know part of Lincoln. If Lincoln, let's say, is 4 parts, we know about 2.5, maybe 2 3/4. That's about it. There's so much about Lincoln that we don't know. There's so much about how he thought, how he his real feelings on lots of things which he refused to truly share. But he was handed one of the most difficult situations as a president, and he handled it. Maybe crazy times required someone that isn't quite on an even keel to deal with. He dealt with a crazy country, and he aged rapidly. A lot of people think he was sick. I don't know. He was still pretty strong, pretty healthy. He just went through hell. But he saved the Union. That was his objective. His ideas on slavery are a little problematic at times. He was very much into colonization. He wanted to free the slaves and send them to Africa. That was his idea. And he got that from Henry Clay and others, you know. And also, he learned a lot from John Quincy Adams, and he studied Adams because Adams was the biggest anti-slave advocate going when he had actually been in Congress and sat near Adams and heard him speak. But he followed a lot of the advice that Adams gave to whomever would be president during the Civil War. So who was Abraham Lincoln? We will never know. You know, the interesting thing about Lincoln is that if we saw footage or heard a recording of him speaking, we might be quite shocked. We might not expect what we hear. We might not expect a style that has been so beautifully polished now because, once again, Disney, the movie, and anything you read about Lincoln has created an image that is marvelous. I think that one of the greatest examples of showing how Lincoln could be a little hard to understand is at Cooper Union in 1860 when he spoke in New York. It took a full 5 minutes for a lot of people to figure out what the hell he was saying. Got to understand, he was sitting there in this wrinkled suit and talking in full Kentucky. And the thing is that they said he would stretch up on his toes and shriek and yell. And he was very much the old-fashioned barnstormer of a politician, like the old preachers, because that's where he learned everything. He watched the old preachers, and that's how he learned to speak. So Lincoln is a fascinating individual, not well known in many respects as to who he is, but in these books, I think you'll find the living Lincoln. Read Herndon's Lincoln. It's the best thing ever written about him because it shows him as he really was. And Lincoln, as I mentioned, is in many respects a historic mystery. Thank you.